Welcome everyone to this IES webinar, Brownfield Land, BNG and Other Opportunities. This webinar has been organised as part of the EIA community and EPIC's BNG in Practice project. And this webinar has also been organised in collaboration with our land condition community. We are really pleased today to be joined by our speakers, John Davies and Tom Henman. John is a director at RSK Biocensus and heads up RSK Wilding, the BNG delivery team, which delivers BNG from initial feasibility assessment and design stage BNG reporting all the way through to implementation and monitoring. Tom is a director at RSK Geosciences and is responsible for leading on sustainability and innovation UK-wide. He has over 25 years' experience advising on land contamination issues and has a long-standing interest in brownfield regeneration. Thank you so much to both of those for joining. For now, over to you, John and Tom. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ethne. Right, you've done the introduction. So is that working for you, by the way, the slides? Is that moved on?
Yeah, all good.
Brilliant. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about. So it is kind of within the BNG in Practice series. So I will be introducing the concept of BNG, how it applies in particular to brownfield and remediation sites. I want to talk about how important brownfield sites can be for biodiversity, and then the implications of remediating those sites and what that means for BNG and for biodiversity loss. And we're going to talk a bit about BNG as an actual opportunity on brownfield land where development isn't going to happen. And then I'll hand over to Tom, who's going to take it further into the sort of where he's going to talk about the brownfield balancing act. So whether it's better to deliver habitat creation or to develop or to do other things. And then we'll have a couple of case studies and a Q&A at the end, as Ethne said. Okay, so apologies for those people who do know what BNG is. I'm going to rattle through this pretty quickly. I think you all know that the UK is pretty horribly nature depleted. And for a long time, all the time I was a consultant, we were sort of reducing impacts on nature, which, you know, when you mitigate impacts, there are still impacts and those add up over time. And so we were and have continued to lose our wild spaces over the last however many years. And so this new act came in, which was very progressive, called the Environment Act 4 years ago now, which mandated development to deliver a 10%, measurable 10% increase in biodiversity. So you end up with more biodiversity with development, which sounds contrary to what you might imagine is possible, and I'll explain how it is possible. The secondary legislation came in only a year or so back. So it's applying to all developments that are Town and Country Planning Act developments. Small sites came in April of last year, and NSIPs, so nationally significant infrastructure projects, are not mandated to deliver BNG. A lot of them do anyway, but that mandating is due to come in at the end of this year. But the bottom line is you will all probably have heard of BNG for quite a few years. It's been in the National Planning Policy framework for quite a long time. A lot of organisations have had BNG policies like National Grid and Network Rail for quite a long time. So it's been here for a while, and hopefully it's here to stay. So this is what the process is very quickly. Again, as I say, I'm going to rattle through this. So as an ecologist, I would do an assessment, a baseline assessment of the site. So let's say you've got a brownfield site like this old clay brickworks in Bedfordshire, and that site we would carry out habitat mapping, habitat survey of that site using what's called the UK HAB system, or the UK Habitats Classification System. And with that, so each of these colours is a different habitat type. And because this is a brownfield site, you've got this red one is open mosaic habitat, which is a standard habitat you get on brownfield sites. And there's a bit of open water and reed bed. So you map the habitats that are there using this system. And then there's something called the statutory biodiversity metric, or the DEFRA metric, where you put those figures into a spreadsheet essentially, and it calculates the biodiversity units, as they call it. So it uses the area of each habitat, its distinctiveness. So in other words, its nature conservation value. So each habitat that you might be mapping will have its own self-applied distinctiveness, and then also the condition of the habitat. So you could have a habitat that is a grassland that's very undergrazed or overgrazed, so it's not in great condition, or it could be in spot-on condition. So you put all of those things into the mix, And then the metric tells you how many biodiversity units you have on your site, and that's your baseline. So if you can see, this is just a screenshot from a metric. So you'll see the on-site baseline here. You've got 62 or 63, sorry, habitat units. BNG is calculated in 3 different ways: habitat area units, hedgerow units, and river units. And on this site, we didn't have any linear features, so it's just habitat area, as you can see. So what happens then, once you know the baseline, I would work as an ecologist with the developer to help them design their scheme to minimize the loss. And so you can retain habitat on site within the red line boundary, and you can enhance that. So if it is poor quality or in poor condition, you can enhance the existing habitat or create new habitat, and that kind of helps you with your overall amount of biodiversity on site. In this situation, we had a film studio that they wanted to build in the northern part of the site, as you can see there. And the idea was to retain the southern part of the site. And so what then happens through the metric is you put in the numbers basically for what happens post development. So all of the habitat that was underneath the development obviously is going to be lost. So that's a significant part of the calculation. The areas that are retained, if we're enhancing them, that gets taken into account. But there are some negative multipliers that get applied when you do the post-development biodiversity. If you're enhancing or creating habitats that are difficult to create, there's a negative multiplier for delivery risk. If it takes a long time, there's time to target conditions. So you get the idea. The metric makes it as accurate as possible as to what's going to be the situation once the development is in place. And so your net change, so whether you've got a biodiversity net gain or not, is the post-development units minus the baseline, obviously. Now, you will all be thinking, no doubt, that that's quite unlikely to happen. And indeed, that is the case, because in many cases, you will have to do offsetting, which I'll talk about in a second. But to go through planning, in order to get a planning consent, you need to demonstrate that there is a 10% net gain. Now, in this circumstance, there definitely wasn't. It was like a 35% net loss. So in order to get planning, you have to have an approach that sets out how you're going to deliver that net gain. And so that's where offsetting comes in, because in many cases, 10% net gain can't be delivered on site. And so you look to offset. So a lot of local authorities have land in their ownership where they're creating habitat banks. So in other words, you've got land that is maybe not great for biodiversity at the moment, but they're going to uplift the biodiversity by creating habitats, and they sell that uplift. That's what a habitat bank is really all about. So local authorities are doing that. Private companies are doing that. Many of you will have heard of the Environment Bank. We do that, RSK Wilding as well, and lots of other companies are doing it. So a lot of habitat banks are popping up around England, which are delivering this uplift in biodiversity. And you can buy credits, a bit like carbon credits. If you've got a development where there's a big loss of habitat and you need a lot of offsetting, then it can be worth your while as a developer to create your own, or get someone like us to create your own bespoke habitat bank, to buy the land and create the habitat, especially for that development. And then the last resort is pretty much the Natural England statutory credits, which are very expensive. And you don't really want to go down there if possible. Now, these offsets are it's regulated. You can't just buy these from some Tom, Dick, or Harry. Basically, habitat banks have to be registered on the Gain site register. They have to be approved, and so they go through quite a process. And they are secured. That land where the uplift in biodiversity is being delivered is secured for 30 years. Either with a Section 106 agreement or a conservation covenant, which is a new contractual agreement. So it's not short term, it's quite a commitment. And you need to demonstrate as a habitat bank over the 30 years that you're going to be uplifting the biodiversity that you're saying, because you're selling that uplift to developers for quite a lot of money. So you do need to demonstrate that you're doing that. And the type of body that oversees that is the regulatory body, is called the responsible body. And DEFRA made it possible for private companies to become regulators or responsible bodies, and we became one as RSK Biosensors, RSK Wilding, about a year ago. So we've got dozens and dozens of habitat banks on our books, and what we're doing is overseeing. We're writing the conservation covenant, and we will be overseeing delivery of those plans for 30 years. So it's a very long-term thing. So ultimately, if you've got a brownfield site, the likelihood of achieving 10% net gain on site could be high if it's all just tarmac, but if it's quite a nice site, then you will need to do some offsetting. So that's broadly how BNG works. So I now want to move on to how it applies to brownfield land in particular. And for a long time, I don't know if any of you remember John Prescott, about 20 years ago when he was Deputy Prime Minister, he was saying brownfield bad, greenfield good, and all development was kind of focused on brownfield land. And you can sort of understand why people would think, ex-development land, previously developed land would be somewhere good to put houses and whatever on. But in actual fact, we lost a lot of really good post-development sites in the Thames Estuary area, for example, over those years. And in actual fact, these sites can be really good for ecology. So it's certainly not as straightforward at all as greenfield is good, brownfield is bad. And this is mainly because on post-development sites, you often have very thin soils with very low nutrient status. And what that means is if you've got low phosphorus and low nitrogen, then grasses tend not to be able to take over. And what that means is all sorts of other plants can thrive because they're not outcompeted by grass. And also that's because you've got lots of different plants, but also lots of different microhabitats, it's really good for invertebrates. And so these sites can be extremely important for biodiversity as it happens. And not least because most of our country is kind of taken up with, arable land or dairy pasture or whatever. And that's not, the sort of habitats you get on these sites are quite rare in the wider countryside. And they have lots of flowers and they're nice sites. It is worth saying that over time, these sites can become a bit less interesting ecologically because they sometimes scrub over with buddleia, for example. So it can have that natural succession to a kind of a single species scrubby habitat, which is less interesting. So I think you get the idea. It's not as straightforward as brown is bad and green is good. And so that it's kind of, this is contrary to the standard perception about brownfield sites that they're not great for wildlife. They really can be, but that can be a constraint and it can be an opportunity. So it can be a constraint if you want to develop on that land, of course, but it can be an opportunity because you can use these sites and intervene on those sites to make them better for wildlife. And so you can uplift the biodiversity and turn it into a habitat bank like we were talking about for those offsetting sites. So, swings and roundabouts, as they say. So developing some brownfield sites is going to be a real big deal and a problem because you're going to lose a lot of biodiversity. But if it's pretty much pure tarmac and hard standing and the odd little buddleous bush, then it will be very low in biodiversity, in which case it'll be very straightforward and there won't be a biodiversity impact or a big one. Now, if a brownfield site, for whatever reason, isn't suitable for development, then these low nutrient soils and the potential of these sites to create really nice habitat is there, and so you've got that potential for offsetting. And if you are someone who owns one of these sites and you can do that, then you could sell these biodiversity units, the uplift that you do by managing these sites, especially for invertebrates and plants. You can sell those to other people, or you can offset the impacts of of other developments you might have. And it's worth saying that this type of habitat, open mosaic habitat on previously developed land, as we call it, is actually quite sought after in BNG terms, not least because a lot of development does go on brownfield land. And therefore, if you're needing to offset the impacts of that development, you need to create this same habitat somewhere else, which is kind of mad when you think about it. I'm just going to quickly touch on the kind of the implications of remediating brownfield sites. And clearly, you do need to clean up a lot of these sites prior to development, and that's quite an intrusive job. Obviously, there's a lot, topsoil stripping and land farming and all the rest of it. It's quite intrusive, and in those cases, obviously, where you've got quite a lot of biodiversity, then that's going to be you might lose almost all of that nice biodiversity just in remediating the site. And if you have, what can be a very expensive remediation process, and you're losing all the biodiversity on site, then it does rather make that sort of site unviable for development, because those two things are very costly before you even start. Now, if you're not developing, it's worth saying a lot of landfill sites in the past would have been capped with topsoil and sown with ryegrass or whatever, and and then returned to agriculture for grazing by sheep or whatever. And that's kind of missing a trick, I think. You've got an opportunity with landfill sites to cap them with a substrate that will be much better for biodiversity, and then you'll be able to create biodiversity that you can then sell. So overall, I think you get the idea that balancing the biodiversity net gain implications and the remediation costs for these sites is really key in decision making about what you're going to do taking these sites forward, which is where Tom is going to come in a second. I'm just going to go through a couple of quick case studies to give you a kind of a flavour for how this pans out in BNG terms. So this is that same site you saw earlier, which is an old clay brickworks. Within the space of about 10 years, it turned into a really lovely site with marsh harriers and bearded tits and what have you, and was designated as a county wildlife site. So it's a really nice site, and building on it was a pretty bad idea, frankly. And in order to get to the 10% net gain, they needed no fewer than 430 biodiversity units off-site. And if you think a biodiversity unit is going for about 30 grand a pop at the moment, do the math, that's millions and millions of pounds. So it can be an extremely costly thing, which is why you shouldn't really build on nice sites. So a big impact equals big offsetting. In this particular situation, we found a site of 70 hectares nearby that was nearly all arable and a bit of modified grass, and we designed the offset to be very much like the habitats that were being lost. And then that needs to be, you need to pay to buy the land, then to manage it for 30 years, and to monitor it for 30 years. So it's just very expensive. So this should be driving people away from building on really nice, good quality brownfield land. Second case study is a former quarry that then became a landfill site. As you can see, it's not too bad for ecology at the moment. It's got a bit of grassland and brush after it was capped a few years back. And the client was looking for what the potential biodiversity uplift could be. And so you can enhance the grassland. There's some hedgerows that could get enhanced and some broadleaf woodland. And we were proposing the creation of some ponds and creation of some scrub. And there were two different scenarios. One where we are enhancing this, what we call other neutral grassland, literally just from moderate condition to good condition. And by doing that over a period of time, the uplift of biodiversity units would be 85. You can just about see, sorry, it's a bit of a small screenshot. So it went from 164 to 249 biodiversity units on site. And so that uplift can then be sold as units, of course, to another developer. Second scenario was to go from that same grasslandy silver habitat to lowland meadow, which is a higher quality, better standard of habitat, and you get more bang for your buck for it. And so that would create 106 biodiversity units. And if you kind of do the math over how much profit you might get from creating that on a site like this over 30 years, that first scenario, we calculated it'd be around about 600 grand to do the enhancement and to do the works over 30 years. That includes the management over 30 years. If you sold the units at the going rate, that would be about 2.4 million. So the profit is about 1.8 million, which is quite a lot for a site that's just sitting there at the minute. But bear in mind that is over 30 years. But scenario two, the costs were not that much more, but you end up with quite a lot more in sales because you're creating a habitat that is worth more. And so the profit would have been nearly 4 million. But it's quite simple to just say that. But in actual fact, selling units is not that easy. There's a real supply and demand thing going on in the market at the moment. There are a lot of habitats being created. So there is no guarantee if you create these units on a site that you can sell them. So it often makes more sense to essentially have a developer who needs units before you kind of press on. And that's what bespoke offsetting is, and that's what we do in RSK Wilding. Okay, so I will hand over to Tom, who's going to kind of look at the broader opportunities and constraints beyond BNG, and then we'll come back for the Q&A at the end, if that's okay, Tom. If you want to stick your camera on. And
yeah, thank you, John.
And I will drive for you, if that's okay.
So having heard from John about some of the opportunities and complexities of applying BNG to brownfield sites, I'm now going to talk about the benefits of a wider approach that we've been developing at RSK that looks at a much wider range of opportunities, as well as the constraints on brownfield sites. And as John's already touched on, to develop or not to develop is often a question. Obviously, government policies promote development of brownfield over greenfield, particularly for housing. But as we've heard, in biodiversity and natural capital terms, this doesn't always make sense. And as well as the rare flora and fauna that John was talking about, which are present on some but not all brownfield sites, such sites may also offer other opportunities in terms of natural capital aspects such as flood alleviation, climate resilience, improving local air quality or carbon sequestration, and may also offer potential in terms of renewable energy generation and storage. In addition, many long-term brownfield sites are located in economically deprived communities, and the value of local quality green spaces for health and well-being really came to the fore during the COVID lockdowns. And I think there's definitely a value attached to these types of sites, which often are are used informally by the public for recreation. So at the same time that looking at the biodiversity aspects, it's also important to look at these much wider range of opportunities. And as we've heard from John, delivering BNG can be challenging when redeveloping vacant or derelict land sites that have developed significant biodiversity potential over time. And such sites can also have a whole series of other constraints, be that land contamination, geotechnical issues, mining, or simple issues like land assembly, or there simply isn't the right type of access to the site. So it's important we understand both the constraints and the opportunities in looking at making that decision as to what's the appropriate end use and whether or not to develop such a site. And where housing or employment use is uneconomic for a number of those reasons, a natural capital-led approach may be preferable. Next slide, please, John. So as John's mentioned, brownfield BNG could be an investment opportunity, particularly lands that is being restored that was in previous use for things like mining, quarries, or landfills, may be more valuable as a biodiversity offset than returns to agricultural use. 1 hectare could yield several biodiversity units, as we've heard, and a current market price is around 25 to 30k per unit. But obviously that's got to include that 30-year period of management and monitoring that John was talking about. And of course, the actual value is going to vary very much dependent on the local market, and there is a risk that the landowner could be left with an unviable asset. But a BNG offset could still be combined with other sources of revenue generation, such as renewable energy or other natural capital opportunities where there are routes to market. And in some cases, there may also be opportunities to undertake longer-term, lower-cost remediation over that 30-year period, so as to reduce environmental liabilities and ultimately increase land value. Next slide, please, John. So what are these potential natural capital-related opportunities beyond BNG? Well, natural capital is defined by the Natural Capital Committee as those elements of the natural environment which provide valuable goods and services to people, such as the stocks of forest, water, land, minerals, and oceans. And essentially, it's applying an economic appraisal to the value of assets and what benefit they provide to society as a whole. Planning policies UK-wide now enshrine the drive towards net zero and the need to increase climate resilience, as well as looking at increasing biodiversity. And of course, habitats that are biodiverse also support this by sequestering carbon and reducing surface water runoff. Other benefits can include flood alleviation through providing compensatory storage or sustainable drainage. An example of that is Scottish Water has been trialling that type of approach in Scotland to provide a new type of offset scheme for local development. There could be carbon sequestration achieved through woodland planting or peatland restoration. There could be pollutant attenuation leading to water quality improvement through the creation of freshwater and wetland habitats. And there could be air quality improvements achieved through tree planting and reducing the presence of bare soils that can cause dusty conditions when it's dry. In addition to all of those aspects, sites that are located near to an existing grid connection or a major user can also be suitable for renewable generation, including solar and wind, battery storage or ground heat options. And these types of uses can be combined with biodiversity and other natural capital enhancements, so-called stacking of benefits. And in addition, of course, there are other social and community benefits to be considered in terms of provision of local green space, active travel, heritage, allotments, and so on and so forth. And looking at, what's the best combination of opportunities and benefits for it is going to be a very site-specific endeavour. And where there are clear routes to market, such as BNG in England currently, and hopefully in due course in the other nations of the UK, the woodland, peat and carbon codes, these can then equate to generating actual revenue for a site. At the moment, in a typical brownfield site won't be generating any revenue, and will be seen as a negative on the landowner's balance sheet. Next slide, please. So that's a summary of the kind of all of the opportunities. But what about the flip side? The site constraints and the potential liabilities. So, as I've mentioned earlier, these could cover a range of aspects. There could be planning or licensing related restrictions, such as landfill permits or licenses, and links to restoration, monitoring, and aftercare requirements linked to planning permission. There could be land contamination risks and remediation requirements, and obviously considering how they might be affected by any change to the site is critical to that and to planning approvals. There could be geotechnical or mining constraints, sites that have a lot of hard standing, particularly reinforced concrete, very expensive to remove that, but obviously that is a big constraint in terms of biodiversity and other aspects. Emerging contaminants such as PFAS increasingly coming to the fore, and there could be future regulatory uncertainties for these types of sites as well. So we need to be thinking about all of these, alongside those opportunities. So the sorts of things we might be thinking about, can BNG or other natural capital opportunities be achieved within site restoration or remediation through that kind of integrated approach that John was talking about? Can low-cost long-term remediation be achieved to reduce liabilities? And how would that be monitored to assess long-term changes in site condition and support aspects such as license surrender? And what are the interactions between these things? There could be some aspects in potential conflict. For example, you wouldn't want to construct a pond on a site that's been capped, such as a landfill, or where there's areas of contamination that could pose a risk to the water environment. Planting can have benefits in immobilizing contamination through phytostabilization. So, those interactions need to be looked at very carefully. Next slide, please. So putting all this together, we developed a combined approach to identifying potential opportunities on what we call marginal land of this nature, which could be brownfield, ex-mining and so on, as well as landfills. And essentially what we're looking to do is look at that full range of potential opportunities to generate revenue and achieve positive outcomes on such sites and consider interactions with the constraints. So key aspects of this combined assessment, we look at identifying and assessing biodiversity, natural capital, and other sources of revenue generation. We look at existing land contamination and geotechnical constraints and identifying opportunities for achieving long-term low-cost remediation, thereby minimizing those future liabilities. And we assess the potential for energy generation through renewables or energy storage. And we use a multi-criteria analysis approach to look at those benefits, look at the potential impacts, and also look at the interactions between them. And we apply a phased approach to this to minimize cost at the earlier stages, then progress more detailed investigations and surveys and assessments on sites that have the most potential for revenue generation. Next slide, please. So just to talk this through in detail, you can just bring up all that first row, John. So we started with initial screening, where we use a GIS-based appraisal, looking at critical data sets for BNG and natural capital, renewables and energy storage opportunities, and those constraints, geo-based and other constraints that I've mentioned. And we combine that with targeted site reconnaissance for initial ground truthing purposes. And the output from that process is looking at the suitability of target sites and areas that are then ranked for further appraisal. And we're applying this kind of approach on portfolios of sites and large areas identified for potential rewilding. You put the next row up, please. So we then move into more detailed desk-based appraisal, looking in more detail, what existing data is available in each of those three areas. That then leads on to a more detailed feasibility assessment of what options might be viable and what the potential benefits might be for particular sites. And obviously that's combined with regulatory consultation, more detailed site surveys and site reconnaissance. And the output from that is this high-level feasibility assessment to identify potential benefits of each option, initial consideration of constraints, and how we might rank those. On the last row, please. And then, having done that, we then go into a process of more detailed site assessment, where we're doing on-the-ground surveys and sampling for all of those three elements. Looking at developing management and monitoring plans. Getting involved in that really important stakeholder consultation, and starting to get agreements in place. On the renewable side, looking at more detailed modelling, options appraisal, and techno-economic feasibility modelling assessment, and potentially on the constraint side, getting into supplementary data collection, geophysical, topographical surveys, intrusive site investigation. The more expensive part of the assessment, which landowners are only going to want to invest in once they've we identified that there really is a strong potential. And we then combine all of those options in a detailed assessment process, look at the interactions with constraints and how mitigation of risks. And then that leads on to how we might combine those revenue generation options, look at stacking, and then to develop implementation plans. So just moving on to the next slide briefly. So just looking at how this might apply to a landfill site, noting that every landfill is different, but there's a number of key considerations that we would look for, such as, I'm not going to talk through everything on the slide, but there's a number of aspects listed there. And really looking at closed landfill sites, obviously this wouldn't be appropriate for active landfill sites, but one of the key constraints relates to how the site has been capped, and what the aftercare requirements and any restrictions there might be in terms of either the license or permit, or under the planning permission that's in place, planning approval in place for that landfill site. And clearly any physical works that damage that cap or could create other pathways for exposure to waste and associated contaminants would need very careful evaluation. Next slide, please. So applying this approach to a couple of case studies here. So the first one for a landfill that was pre-licensing, so before the 1990s, or that has a surrendered permit. The advantages for these types of sites are generally you have very little in the way of licensing restrictions. Aftercare requirements may well be complete. It should be physically stable, no ongoing gas or leachate generation. But on the downside, often you've got a lack of information about these types of sites in terms of what waste has been accepted, what contaminants may be present, and how the site was capped or lined. That then means you may need to spend more in terms of assessing those issues. And planning approval may be required for change of use from that restoration plan. So the bottom there summarises our sort of initial assessment of different constraints, with three there that obviously would need more detailed evaluation. And then for the second case, you can click that again. The second there for a site that's been closed but still has an active license or permit. Well, the advantage is you've got a lot more information for that type of site to do that evaluation. But on the downside, the site may not have physically stabilised, particularly if it accepted degradable waste. There may be ongoing gas or leachate generation and associated monitoring and management of that. You've got license and permit conditions to be complied with, and you've also got likely aftercare requirements. So you've got a much more restrictive constraint in terms of licenses and regulatory requirements. And again, a number of other aspects that would need to be looked at further. So that hopefully gives a bit of an illustration of how we look at sites through this combined approach. Back to you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Hold on, let me put my camera back on. So, yeah, hopefully this was, this is BNG in practice, but hopefully it's helpful for you to understand how it might fit into a wide range of other uses for brownfield sites, and what the BNG implications are for any of that work that Tom was talking about. I guess it's over to questions, Ethne. If you've got any, I'll leave the.
That's great.
Up.
Just firstly, a massive thank you to you both for that presentation. A really useful overview of BNG and brownfield land, and really great to hear about the kind of integrated, holistic approach you can take with these sites as well. So thank you for that. We do have questions coming through, so I'm just going to dive straight into those. The first one we've got here is, if you're planning on turning your contaminated brownfield site into a credit bank or habitat site, what level of risk assessment is needed? Is it things like a controlled waters, GQRA or DQRA, or is there something more specific?
I'll start with that, Tom, if that's okay, but you'll know the more technical detail. Because we're a responsible body, Ethne, so we oversee habitat banks. I know that the process, we have a due diligence process on all of the sites that we take on. And there is a legal due diligence and there is an environmental due diligence. And so we're looking at, certainly for brownfield sites, that would be a higher level of assessment that we would need to do than if it was just a normal arable field or a grassland or whatever. So that level of due diligence that we do before we're content to take on a habitat bank is the bit that we do. But I think that there's a more technical aspect that we would get Tom involved with if there were real risks to the environment. Bearing in mind that when you create habitat, unless you're going in and with a digger and digging out big ponds, normally what you're doing is just creating habitat with a low intervention kind of method. So you're not really breaking up the habitat too much. So those risks are probably quite low. But Tom, you can probably answer the contamination.
Well, inevitably, I'm going to say it's site specific, isn't it? Because it depends what the issues are. But I think it is important to recognise that the regulation of these sites is different from standard development, where you're going through a planning approval process. And obviously, as part of that, you've got to demonstrate the site's suitable for use, and you may have planning conditions. It's a completely different process by which is being followed. So, but LCRM and the standard approach to assessment of that site, obviously starting with desk-based assessment and moving through data collection and refining your conceptual site model through intrusive investigation and so on. You would follow that standard process, and obviously looking at the implications of of any changes you were making. If you were looking to construct a pond on the site, well, clearly you would want to assess the impacts of that. Would that interface with contamination and potentially we don't want to create any new linkages.
That's great, thank you. Oh yeah,
just quickly, sorry, I think so that would be the responsibility of the landowner. We as a responsible body are overseeing and making sure they're doing the right things, but there would definitely be red flags for us if it's a post-development site where there were contaminated issues, and we would make sure that they're going through that process that Tom was talking about.
That makes sense, thank you. Another attendee's here written that it's my understanding that planning often happens in isolation. So when determining whether developing your brownfield site is better for BNG versus the same development on a greenfield site, do you use some kind of generic measure for what a greenfield site development might look like? For example, if you calculate your BNG for a certain development on your brownfield site, how do you know if that's better or worse than the development being done on a greenfield site?
We'd go through the same process for a brownfield or a greenfield. And what you can absolutely have brownfield sites that are much better for biodiversity than a greenfield site, but absolutely the other way around. A lot of greenfield, which is seen as good for ecology, is absolute rubbish. And so if that is the site that's going to be developed, then you need to go through the same process of calculating what the baseline is. And often, if it's an arable field, then getting 10% net gain on that will be quite easy because it's a bit of a biodiversity desert at the moment. So you might be able to retain a bit in the corner, for example, where you build a pond or you create a bit of nice grass and habitat or whatever, and that might be enough to get you to your 10%, because overall the biodiversity is so low over that site. Even if you build on 80% of it, you can still achieve 10% net gain on site. I hope that's answered the question. It was quite a long question.
Yeah, thank you, John. And just one for you, Tom, I think. You mentioned briefly around stacking different kind of benefits from a site. And could you maybe expand a little bit on carbon credit and biodiversity units and how they can stack together? And then I wonder, sorry, just to expand on that a little bit, kind of your views on how open clients are to exploring kind of the different benefits that sites can give, depending on how you kind of the routes you go down with it.
Yeah, and I should preface my answer with I'm not an expert in natural capital, but I rely on my colleagues in Binnies who do those appraisals. But this is an area that is obviously developing very rapidly, and you know, where we are varies according to the 4 different nations. You know, Scotland's published its natural capital framework, looking at how that will be taken forward. And obviously, BNG is not yet a thing in Scotland, but it is obviously a developing market in England. So it does vary by the 4 nations. At the moment, there are a limited number, as I understand it, of opportunities, routes to market. Obviously, you've got BNG in England. You've got the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code. But these wider range of benefits, basically, these natural capital frameworks that are being established by governments are looking to bring private sector investment into restoration of sites and increasing natural capital for each country as a whole. And stacking of those benefits, is a developing area, but it's going to be part of that. Clearly, there are uncertainties in that, and there are gaps. And for brownfield sites, soil carbon is not a well understood area currently, and there's really very little data. So at the moment, there isn't a mechanism by which you could increase soil carbon on a brownfield site and then claim credits back for that. You would be having to plant trees or improving peatland where that's a relevant habitat. So a developing area, but yes, in principle.
Can I just add? So it is important to say that you can't stack carbon and biodiversity. So creating nice habitat can sequester carbon and be good for carbon, but you can't get paid for carbon credits and biodiversity credits. That's the one kind of main rule that applies here. But otherwise, what we're trying to do is come up with a whole basket of opportunities for someone who's got land. What's the best way of getting revenue from this land? And if the bit in the corner is good for biodiversity, but that bit over there is good for a wind turbine or whatever, that's the process we're trying to go through. And especially when you've got to remediate a site and that's expensive, then you've got to come up with some good ways of making an income. One last thing to say is that the BNG is a regulated market. It's a compliance market, essentially. It is underpinned by legislation, so developers are required to deliver it. That's good because it sets a real market, it sets a real need. There will also be a voluntary biodiversity market that is much more nascent, but there are companies that have impacts on the environment that want to do the right thing. They're not necessarily required as with BNG, but they might want to invest in a site to create habitat on site. So that's another route to market that I think is potentially going to build up over time. Where there isn't demand for BNG, because BNG is completely development related, right? So there might be a part of the country where there's very little development and there aren't people hungry for biodiversity units, in which case the voluntary market might be another way.
That's great. Well, a massive thank you to you both. That's been a really useful session. So thank you so much for attending, for presenting, and a massive thank you to all our attendees today. I'm afraid that that's all the time we have for questions, but thank you for putting them in there. And if you are watching the recording on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. And if you've enjoyed today's webinar and you're not a member, please do consider joining the IES. For now, Thank you, Tom and John, and everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.